Imagine stepping into the shoes of arguably the most famous, most influential entrepreneur on the planet right now.
Right. Someone who is just, at the absolute pinnacle of global capitalism.
Exactly. You've built rockets that land themselves. You've completely rewired the global auto industry. And, well, you own one of the world's most critical communication platforms.
You have a megaphone that reaches hundreds of millions of people.
Yeah, a massive megaphone. And from that unparalleled vantage point, you turn around, look back at the country where you were born, and you just declare that its current trajectory is a complete, fundamental betrayal of one of history's greatest moral leaders.
It's not just a casual critique either.
No, I mean, you aren't just complaining about a tax policy or a trade deal. You are making this explosive claim that the current government is actively, systematically reverse engineering the very machinery of oppression that the country bled to dismantle.
It's a staggering accusation, really, to just hurl that onto the global stage.
It really is.
Because it forces anyone watching to look past the daily noise of the news cycle and grapple with these incredibly heavy questions about history and power and, the dark reality of what actually happens decades after a revolution formally succeeds.
Welcome to the deep dive. We are wading into some incredibly intense, highly charged waters today.
Very charged.
Yeah. We are breaking down an April 2026 blog post titled Blackface, Mandela Fought for Equality, Not Reverse Apartheid. And it's penned by Paramendra Kumar Bhagat.
Who is a fascinating figure to be writing this.
Totally. He brings this wildly eclectic perspective to the table.
Yeah.
I mean, if you skim his broader body of work, you'll find him dissecting artificial intelligence in sci-fi novels, like his book, The Country of Geniuses one day, and then breaking down complex Middle Eastern geopolitics the next.
Right. So he brings this incredibly broad, highly opinionated, cross-disciplinary lens to modern global events.
Exactly. But before we take another step, we really need to establish some ground rules here, because you and I both know this is a total minefield of a topic.
Absolutely. We are dealing with really raw, sensitive issues here. Race, systemic governance, historical trauma.
Yeah.
And so for you listening, we need to be crystal clear. We are not here today to act as judge and jury. We aren't endorsing these claims, and we aren't debunking them.
Right. No side-taking.
Exactly. Our sole focus is to dissect the architecture of the argument being presented in this specific piece of writing. We want to understand the philosophical collision happening within it, what exactly is being claimed, and the underlying logic driving those claims.
Absolutely essential context to keep in the front of our minds as we go through this. So let's get right into the catalyst.
The spark that set this off?
Right. The immediate trigger for this deep dive and for Bhagat's article is Elon Musk's highly visible digital campaign against South Africa's current post-apartheid government, tracking right up through, April 2026.
And Musk's central thesis here is that the ruling government, which is heavily pushed by political factions like the EFF.
That's the Economic Freedom Fighters, right?
Yeah, exactly. He's claiming they've built an institutional system of what he calls reverse racism.
But the hook here, and what the article focuses on, is that Musk isn't just saying prejudice exists in people's hearts. He's arguing that the sheer bureaucratic scale of this new system actually exceeds the discrimination of the original apartheid era.
The scale is the entire point of his argument. The numbers cited in the text are just jarring.
Yeah, I mean, what are we talking about here?
Well, Musk points to a web of roughly 100 to 142 explicit race-based laws currently operating in South Africa.
Wait, 142?
Up to 142, yeah. And we aren't talking about abstract cultural biases or microaggressions. We are talking about codified legislation that specifically discriminates against non-Black citizens.
So that includes white and Asian populations.
Correct. And it's in the most fundamental areas of economic survival: employment, business licensing, property rights. The text argues it is a massive, interlocking bureaucratic net.
Okay, let's unpack this, because 142 race-based laws could just sound like a dry textbook statistic. Let's make it tangible.
What?
Imagine you're trying to build a house, right? But the city keeps changing the permitting rules based entirely on your ancestry.
That's a good way to look at it.
Or think of it like this. Imagine the entire economy functions like a massive, complex operating system. Apartheid was this closed-source, hard-coded operating system designed explicitly to benefit a minority.
Right.
And Nelson Mandela's revolution was supposed to make that system open source, accessible to everyone,
Yeah.
But the argument being made here by Musk and Bhagat is that the current government didn't rewrite the code to make it open source.
They just changed the admins.
Exactly. They kept the exact same restrictive, closed-source architecture, complete with all the firewalls and access blocks, and they simply swapped the administrator passwords. So now, if you want to start a supply chain, or hire a team, or secure permit, your access is determined entirely by an ancestral checklist.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize the friction Musk is describing. It's an administrative nightmare where your genetic background dictates your economic mobility.
And it's not just theoretical for him.
No, the article grounds this in a very specific, high-stakes corporate standoff involving Musk himself, Starlink.
Right, his satellite internet network.
Exactly. Starlink is entirely blocked from operating in South Africa. And the reason given in the text is incredibly blunt. It is blocked solely because Elon Musk is not black.
Which is just, I mean, an astonishing twist of irony considering he was literally born in Pretoria.
Right.
You have the man who engineered the satellites, who launched the rockets, who owns the entire infrastructure, being barred from providing internet to his birth country.
And the detail that really highlights the mechanics of this operating system you mentioned is what happened next.
What did they do?
Well, the text claims government officials allegedly offered him a workaround, a quote-unquote bribe-like solution where he would essentially find a black owner to front the operation.
A fronting mechanism.
Exactly. The suggestion is to set up a shell company, install a figurehead who possesses the correct racial demographic to satisfy the licensing laws, and then conduct the actual business behind that facade.
And Musk famously refused.
He refused strictly on principle.
But wait, let me push back on that for a second. From a pure business standpoint, companies do bureaucratic gymnastics all the time to enter emerging markets. I mean, they jump through hoops, they partner with locals. Why draw the hard line in the sand here?
That's a great question. The text implies that participating in that workaround would require him to validate the very system he is actively trying to dismantle on the global stage.
I see.
If he sets up a front company, he is quietly submitting to a racial quota system. By refusing, he anchors his abstract complaints, the stuff about the 140-plus laws, into a highly visible, principled corporate boycott.
It allows him to shift the narrative.
Completely. It's no longer just Starlink is having regulatory trouble in Pretoria. It suddenly becomes Starlink refuses to participate in Apartheid 2.0.
Apartheid 2.0. I mean, that phrase is doing so much heavy lifting. It's totally weaponized language.
It is entirely deliberate. What's fascinating here is how he is taking the ultimate historical symbol of systemic evil, the very regime that the current South African government was quite literally formed to defeat, and he is slapping that label squarely onto their foreheads.
Yeah, that's intense.
He also uses the phrase, anti-white is the new apartheid. The psychological shock value of that rhetorical flip is immense.
It really bypasses all the polite, cautious language of international diplomacy.
Exactly. It's designed to force everyone to look at the raw mechanics of what is actually happening, at least according to his perspective.
But the article makes it very clear that we aren't just talking about the frustrations of billionaire corporate licensing. I mean, if this was just about Starlink, it would be a business story on page 4 of the financial section.
Right.
The text moves us rapidly from boardroom red tape to literal, physical, existential threats.
Huh.
This is where we start to see why Musk argues this trajectory will result in the total collapse of the nation.
We really shift from the bureaucratic to the visceral here. The argument zeroes in on extreme violence and what is portrayed as terrifying government complicity. Yeah. Specifically, the focus turns to the ongoing crisis of farm attacks in South Africa and the explosive rhetoric surrounding them.
Right. We are talking about massive public rallies held by the EFF, led by Julius Malema. The piece points out that at these rallies, you have stadium-sized crowds actively chanting for the killing of white people.
The kill the Boer chants.
Exactly. And the most chilling element of this, the thing that is aggressively highlighted in the argument, isn't just that a radical faction is chanting this, it's the government's posture toward it.
The allegation is a profound, deafening silence from the state. The government effectively shrugs at stadium-level calls for racial violence.
Which is wild.
This is why Musk labels Julius Malema the anti-Mandela. If Mandela is the global icon of racial reconciliation, Malema is framed here as the architect of racial retribution.
And think about the linguistic gymnastics happening at the state level regarding the people trying to flee this environment.
Oh, this part is staggering.
The piece notes that officials have labeled white refugees fleeing the country as cowards who are merely trying to escape racial justice.
Yeah.
Musk calls this purely Orwellian. It takes a second to really process how dark that framing is. They're redefining the act of fleeing targeted violence and systemic discrimination as an attempt to dodge justice.
It's a complete inversion of reality. And the text argues that if you accept the premise that violence against a specific demographic is a form of justice, well, you lay the necessary philosophical groundwork for the next massive economic threat.
Okay.
Land expropriation without compensation.
Okay, let's dig into that because the author draws a very deliberate, hard line here. They make it clear that the concept of land reform is not inherently the problem. The piece acknowledges that democratic land reform, using the courts, paying fair market compensation, targeting genuinely unused land, is a valid way to address historical grievances.
Right. No one is arguing that history doesn't need to be addressed.
Exactly. The catastrophic line in the sand, according to the author, is seizure, confiscation without payment. So, what is the author's underlying economic philosophy here? How does the threat of seizing a farm translate into a national economic collapse?
It brings us to the core economic battle underpinning this entire critique. It is a clash between two wildly different models of human prosperity. The zero-sum game versus the pie-expanding reality of wealth creation.
Break that down for me.
Let's look at the mechanics of capital. In a zero-sum worldview, wealth is a fixed, static pie.
Okay.
If I want a bigger slice, the only physical way to get it is to take your slice away. The argument is that the current government is operating on this exact zero-sum logic. They believe they can legislate prosperity for the previously disadvantaged by punitively seizing assets from the minority.
But wealth doesn't actually work that way. Wealth is dynamic.
Exactly.
Right, because think about it. The moment the government declares it has the legal authority to simply take a farm, that farm instantly loses its value.
Overnight.
The bank will no longer issue a loan using that land as collateral. Because why would they? The state could take it tomorrow. And if the farmer can't get a loan, they can't buy new tractors.
Which means the tractor dealership in the local town goes out of business.
Yeah, and the people working at the dealership lose their jobs. The entire economic ecosystem freezes out of fear.
Exactly. You haven't redistributed wealth. You have destroyed the mechanisms that generate it. Capital flight accelerates, investment dries up, and everyone is left holding a much smaller pie.
It's a domino effect.
The author argues that this punitive approach is a fast track to national ruin, explicitly pointing to the historic collapse of Zimbabwe as the inevitable result of land seizure policies.
It's scary stuff.
Yeah.
And to counter this zero-sum thinking, the author uses this brilliant narrative device. They hold up Elon Musk's own life as the ultimate proof of concept for the pie-expanding model of economics.
It's a very sharp rhetorical move. The author looks at Musk's origin story. He leaves Pretoria as a teenager. He arrives in Canada with next to nothing. He is sleeping on the floor of a YMCA, surviving on a few dollars a day, while building his first software company, Zip2.
Right. And from there, he builds PayPal, SpaceX, Tesla. He didn't build those empires by confiscating someone else's factory.
No, he didn't.
He didn't seize property. He created entirely new industries. He baked entirely new, massive pies.
Precisely. The core argument here is that wealth is the byproduct of human ingenuity, risk-taking, and voluntary exchange.
Not government redistribution.
Right. The author explicitly states that a nation like South Africa is sitting on a gold mine of human capital.
Oh.
It could produce thousands of brilliant entrepreneurs, but if a state chooses to punish talent based on skin color and threatens the fundamental right to own the fruits of your labor, well, that talent will simply leave.
You drive away the very minds capable of building the future. Think about how often we see policies built on the idea that for one group to win, another must lose. The author is arguing that this zero-sum mindset is a fast track to national decline.
And their assessment of the politicians driving these policies is absolutely devastating. They don't view them as misguided progressives. They call them the exact mirror image of the old apartheid regime's worst impulses.
Was the quote, "The country simply swapped the colors of the oppressors."
It's a brutal indictment. It asserts that the structural evil of apartheid wasn't dismantled at all. It was just handed over to new management.
Wow.
But, to truly prove that this is a betrayal, the argument can't just rely on how bad things are today. It has to firmly establish what was originally promised.
Right, we have to establish the historical baseline. We've heard the dystopian modern view from Musk and the author, but you can't claim someone betrayed a legacy unless you can clearly define what that legacy was.
Yeah.
So what did Nelson Mandela actually want?
The author is incredibly meticulous here. They don't let the reader rely on some fuzzy, sanitized pop culture memory of Mandela as just a nice guy who liked peace.
Yeah, a lot of people just picture the smiling guy in the colorful shirts.
Exactly. But the author goes straight to the foundational primary source documents to lock in his uncompromising vision for a non-racial democracy.
It starts with the 1955 Freedom Charter. This was the document adopted at the Congress of the People in Cliptown, which really laid out the core demands of the anti-apartheid movement. And the opening line, which the piece emphasizes, leaves zero room for ambiguity.
What does it say?
It states, South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white.
The inclusion of the phrase black and white is pivotal. It wasn't South Africa belongs to the historically oppressed. It was a radical, inclusive declaration.
It really was.
The charter demanded equal rights for all national groups, equality before the law, and that the land should be shared by those who work it. The author uses this to prove that the DNA of the liberation struggle was never a call for racial retribution. It was an explicit call for a shared egalitarian society.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The true moral crescendo of this argument, and honestly, arguably of the entire 20th century, happens in 1964 at the Rivonia trial.
Oh, yes, the defining moment.
Mandela is in the dock. He is facing the very real possibility of being sentenced to death by the state. And he delivers his famous, "I am prepared to die" speech. The piece highlights one specific, world-shaking sentence. I fought against white domination, and I fought against black domination.
That concept is the absolute fulcrum upon which this entire critique rests.
I really want to sit with this for a second for anyone listening, because the psychology of that moment is almost incomprehensible.
It's hard to fathom.
It is entirely natural to hate the people who are oppressing you. To fight back against the boot on your neck is human instinct. But it requires an almost superhuman level of philosophical clarity to stand in front of the very government that is preparing to execute you and declare that you will go to war with your own side just as fiercely if they ever attempt to wear that same boot.
It is the ultimate proof of his moral framework. The author points out that Mandela's goal was never a revenge fantasy.
Right.
Mandela understood a profound truth. White supremacy inherently implies black inferiority. Therefore, simply swapping the roles, replacing a white supremacist system with a black supremacist system, would validate the underlying diseased logic of racism itself.
It would admit that society must be structured around racial domination.
Exactly. It would concede that the oppressors were right about how the world works, they just had the wrong people in charge. Mandela refused to validate that premise.
The piece argues that his vision was deeply humanist. He believed that racism fundamentally degrades both the victim and the perpetrator. It destroys the soul of the oppressor just as surely as it harms the oppressed.
Spending 27 years in a prison cell wasn't a waiting game until it was his turn to hold the whip. It was a crucible meant to bury the concept of a racial hierarchy forever.
Which is incredibly powerful. But, it brings us to a massive point of friction. It is relatively easy to harbor pure, uncompromised ideals when you are writing a manifesto in a field in 1955 or when you were giving a defiant speech from a prisoner's dock in 1964.
Sure.
But ideals face their ultimate stress test when they collide with absolute power. Because in 1994, Mandela didn't just walk out of prison, he walked into the presidency. He gained the levers of state power. So how did he actually govern when he had the ability to implement his vision?
Well, the piece points to the profound healing tone of his 1994 inauguration. He spoke of a covenant to build a society where all people could walk without fear.
The famous rainbow nation at peace with itself.
Yes, he made a solemn promise that the land would never again experience the oppression of one by another.
Okay, but I have a massive problem with this line of reasoning, and I think anyone looking at the history would flag this immediately. We know for a fact that Mandela supported and implemented affirmative action.
He did.
It was a core part of his government's policy. So wait, if Mandela supported affirmative action, couldn't today's government argue they are just continuing his work? How can Musk or this author possibly claim that today's 140-plus race-based laws are a betrayal? Aren't they just expanding on the exact tools Mandela himself authorized?
That is the crucial tension, and to be fair, the author anticipates that exact counterargument.
Okay, how do they square that?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the distinction being drawn here is the profound difference between a temporary ladder and a permanent ceiling.
A temporary ladder and a permanent ceiling. Explain the mechanics of that difference.
According to the argument, Mandela viewed affirmative action strictly as a temporary tool for redress. After centuries of deliberate economic starvation, you cannot simply say, everyone is equal now and expect a fair race.
Right, because some people are starting miles behind the starting line.
Precisely. You have to actively build ladders to bring the historically disadvantaged up to that starting line. But the key word is temporary. It was designed to create new opportunities, not to establish a permanent architecture of exclusion.
Opportunity versus permanent restriction.
Exactly. The piece argues that Mandela never envisioned a permanent system of rigid quotas that would forever dictate who could own a business or hold a job. It was meant to lift people up without structurally hobbling anyone else.
That makes sense.
The author actually quotes a 1993 speech where Mandela actively reassured minority communities that affirmative action was not a threat to their individual rights or to societal standards.
And there's a devastating quote pulled from a 1991 speech at the University of Pretoria. Mandela explicitly stated, "There is no reason to fear that the ANC is going to do to whites what whites have done to blacks."
That quote is used as the ultimate measuring stick in the article. The author is taking that specific promise and laying it over the reality of 2026.
And they don't match up.
Not at all. They argue that permanent punitive quotas, the blocking of global companies like Starlink based purely on the founders' race, and the looming threat of land confiscation are a total fundamental rupture from Mandela's vision of temporary merit-inclusive redress.
The distinction is really sharp when you look at it that way. Under Mandela, the policies were about bringing everyone onto the track. The current system, as described by Musk, is about permanently breaking the ankles of specific runners based on their ancestry and calling that a fair race.
That's a brutal analogy, but it perfectly captures the text's argument. And that profound deviation brings us to the absolute precipice. We've dissected Musk's dire warnings about the modern bureaucratic nightmare. We've explored the historical purity of Mandela's original vision.
So what happens when these two realities collide in the present day? I mean, what are the actual stakes for South Africa right now based on this text?
The stakes, according to the arguments presented, are nothing short of national survival. If South Africa remains on this zero-sum retributive path, Musk isn't just complaining on the internet. He is calling for severe, tangible international action.
Right, he wants consequences.
He is advocating for international sanctions against South Africa, strict travel bans for politicians pushing these policies, and the freezing and seizure of assets belonging to figures like Julius Malema.
Which is, think about the historical irony of that proposed playbook. Musk is asking the global community to deploy the exact same diplomatic and economic weapons against the current government that were ultimately used to break the back of the original apartheid regime.
It's true. He is calling for total geopolitical isolation.
It sets up an incredibly stark, uncompromising binary choice for the nation moving forward. It's a clear fork in the road, down one path. An embrace of equality under the law, the protection of property rights, and the pie-expanding reality of wealth creation.
And down the other path.
The visceral thrill of racial revenge, leading inevitably to economic collapse and national decline.
The author pulls all these threads together to make a final, really powerful point about Mandela's legacy. Mandela's vision wasn't some naive, soft-hearted utopian dream. The piece calls it hard-won realism.
Right.
Mandela understood the brutal math of nation-building. He knew that indulging in the endless cycle of racial score settling wouldn't just be morally wrong, it would physically destroy the country from the inside out. He recognized that true progress required leveraging the talents of every single citizen.
So the argument is that if you turn Mandela's legacy into a grievance machine, if you adopt the mindset of, now it's our turn to hold the whip, you are effectively erasing the man from history.
They're undoing his life's work.
Replacing white domination with black domination doesn't honor his struggle. It proves you fundamentally misunderstood the entire point of his life.
And importantly, the piece stresses that this destructive path is a choice, not an inevitability. South Africa actually possesses the institutional framework necessary to navigate this correctly.
They have the tools.
They do. They have a post-1994 democratic constitution. They have an independent judiciary. They have the mechanisms to conduct lawful democratic land reform without resorting to asset seizure.
But choosing to abandon those institutions in favor of what the author calls soul-destroying tribalism will turn a miracle nation into a geopolitical cautionary tale.
The warning couldn't be more blunt. The piece explicitly states that history has already run this exact experiment right next door in Zimbabwe, and South Africa does not have to repeat it.
It is a desperate plea for the nation to look back at its own foundational blueprints before it crosses an economic and moral event horizon from which it cannot return.
It really is.
So what does this all mean? When you step back and look at the entirety of this argument, it presents us with a deeply unsettling, tragic irony. It's the terrifying idea that the very mechanisms used to defeat apartheid, the legislative power, the righteous political mobilization, the powerful rhetoric of historical justice, are actively being reverse-engineered into a new version of the exact same machine.
Yeah.
That the noble fight for universal equality has been hijacked, stripped for parts, and rebuilt into an engine of retribution.
It perfectly captures the philosophical collision we set out to map today. It is the eternal tension between the slow, painstaking, often frustrating work of building a truly inclusive society and the immediate, intoxicating, destructive appeal of settling historical scores.
This has been an incredibly heavy, dense journey today. We've traced the architecture and explosive modern critique, looked at the brutal realities of zero-sum economics, and held it all up against the historical standard set by one of the 20th century's most vital figures. It is a topic that demands rigorous analysis over rapid-fire reactions.
I agree completely. And as we wrap up, there is one final thread I think we need to pull on, something that lingers in the background of this entire discussion.
What's that?
Well, we have spent an hour looking at the incredible stabilizing power of a founder's original words, the way Mandela's Rivonia speech attempted to hold a moral line against oppression from all directions.
The tension remains.
Precisely, because it leaves us with something incredibly profound to ponder. When a newly birthed nation's founding ideals of absolute equality inevitably collide with the desperate, visceral, immediate demands of a previously oppressed majority seeking rapid economic redress, can a piece of paper, no matter how beautifully written, actually hold the line against human nature?
Wow. A question that resonates far beyond the borders of any single country.
Yeah.
Keep pushing past the surface, keep asking the hard questions, and we will see you on the next deep dive.